My brother said he would never betray family. But when our father died, he forged the will and took all the inheritance for himself. He thought I would just accept it. He didn't know I could play the long game. I still remember the day Dad handed me my first wrench. I was 10 years old, standing in the original Miller's auto shop, watching him work his magic under the hood of a '67 Mustang. He placed the cold metal in my small hands and said, "Michael, remember this, what we build with our hands nobody can take from us. And what we build as a family stays in the family." For 30 years, I believed that. I watched Dad transform that single garage into Miller & Sons Auto Care, a network of 12 high-end repair shops across 3 states. Even when Mom passed and it was just me, Dad, and my brother Thomas, we stuck together. Dad was the backbone, I was the mechanical genius who modernized our services, and Thomas, with his law degree and smooth talking, handled the business side. Family above everything, Dad would toast at our Sunday dinners. Thomas would raise his glass the highest. When Dad's health began failing last year, we both took turns caring for him. I'd drive over after closing the flagship shop to sit with him, talking about carburetors and fuel injection systems while Thomas reviewed the company's finances with him. I never questioned their closed-door meetings, I trusted my brother completely. The day Dad died, Thomas was the one who found him. He called me, voice cracking, saying Dad had gone peacefully in his sleep. I rushed over, and we held each other, crying like we were kids again. In that moment, I felt closer to my brother than I had in years. "We'll get through this together," Thomas said, his arm around my shoulder. Just like Dad always wanted. The funeral was a testament to how respected my father was. Hundreds showed up, employees, customers, competitors who'd become friends. I was too numb to speak, so Thomas delivered the eulogy. He spoke beautifully about Dad's integrity, his belief in honest work, and his dedication to family values. "My father built more than a business," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "He built a legacy that Michael and I will honor by carrying forward together, as brothers and partners, just as he always intended." I looked at him with gratitude, thinking how lucky I was to have him by my side during this impossible time. 3 days after we laid Dad to rest, we met with his attorney, Richard Patel, at the family home. Thomas brought coffee for everyone, squeezing my shoulder as he handed me mine. "I'm here for you, little brother," he whispered. Mr. Patel, who'd been Dad's friend for decades, seemed unusually tense as he laid out the leather portfolio containing the will. "Before I begin," he said, glancing between us, "I want to express again how sorry I am for your loss. James was one of the finest men I've known." "Thank you, Richard," Thomas said. "We're ready whenever you are." I nodded, expecting what Dad had always told us, that the business and assets would be split equally between Thomas and me, with me running the technical operations and Thomas handling the administrative side. Mr. Patel adjusted his glasses and began reading. The standard legal preamble washed over me until 5 words snapped me back to attention. "Sole heir of my estate." I looked up. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Mr. Patel cleared his throat. "All business assets, properties, accounts, and personal effects are to be transferred to my son, Thomas James Miller, as the sole heir of my estate." The room began to spin. "That's impossible," I said, my voice barely audible. "Dad always said we'd share everything. There must be a mistake." Thomas placed his hand over mine. "Mike, I'm as surprised as you are." But he wasn't. As I turned to look at him, I caught something in his eyes, a flash of calculation quickly masked by manufactured concern. "Richard," I said, "when was this will dated?" 2 months ago, Mr. Patel replied, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "It supersedes the previous will from 3 years ago. When Dad was already declining. When Thomas was spending hours alone with him, discussing finances. Dad wasn't thinking clearly then," I protested. "He was on heavy medication. He wouldn't have cut me out. Thomas's face arranged itself into a perfect mask of compassion. Mike, I know this is hard to accept. Dad changed in his final months. He worried about your impulsiveness with money. Remember that expansion plan you pushed for last year? He thought you might risk everything he built. That's not true, I said, my voice rising. That expansion is already profitable. Dad was proud of it. He was concerned, Thomas insisted gently. Look, this doesn't change anything between us. I'll make sure you're taken care of. You'll still run the shops, still get a generous salary. But not as an owner. As an employee. Of my own family business. I looked at Mr. Patel. I want to contest this. Dad wasn't in his right mind. The attorney shifted uncomfortably. You can certainly try, Michael, but the will is quite thorough. There's a letter attached in your father's handwriting explaining his decision, with witnesses from outside the family. Thomas nodded solemnly. I didn't want to mention the letter. I was hoping to spare your feelings. That's when I knew with absolute certainty, Thomas had engineered the whole thing. The convenient timing, the outside witnesses who could testify to Dad's competence, the handwritten letter that I'd bet my life was a forgery. My brother, the attorney, had created an airtight case. I stood up so quickly my chair toppled backward. You did this, I said, my voice shaking. You manipulated him when he was weak. You forged that letter. Thomas's expression hardened just slightly before melting back into sympathy. You're upset, Mike. I understand. Take some time, process this. We'll talk when you're thinking more clearly. I wanted to lunge across the table, to force a confession out of him. But something in me, something cold and clear, held back. If Thomas had gone to such lengths to steal everything, confronting him directly would only make him more defensive. More careful. Instead, I took a deep breath, righted my chair, and sat back down. You're right, I said quietly. I need time. Thomas looked relieved, and for a second, disappointed. Had he wanted a scene? Had he prepared for one? Take all the time you need, he said magnanimously. Nothing changes at work. You're still my brother. I nodded, already retreating into my thoughts, already planning. Because while Thomas had spent his life learning to manipulate legal documents, I had spent mine learning something far more valuable: how systems work, how they break, and how to rebuild them from the ground up. The next day, I showed up at the main office as if nothing had happened. Thomas seemed surprised but pleased. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, he said, clapping me on the back. I mustered a tight smile. It's what Dad would want. Over the next weeks, I maintained the facade of acceptance. I ran the shops with the same dedication I always had, stayed late fixing the toughest problems, mentored the junior mechanics. But I watched Thomas, cataloging his every move as he began to reshape Dad's company. The first changes were subtle. Thomas moved into Dad's corner office, replacing the practical, worn furniture with sleek, expensive pieces. He hired a personal assistant, a young woman named Amber who wore designer clothes and called him Mr. Miller with breathless admiration. Then came the business decisions. Thomas immediately took out a large business loan against the company's assets, $2.5 million that disappeared into investment accounts only he could access. He started talking about brand elevation and market repositioning. We need to target a more upscale clientele, he announced at a staff meeting 1 month after Dad's death. I'm thinking we rebrand as Thomas Miller Automotive Group. More exclusive, more personal. Our father's name, erased. Just like that. I said nothing, just nodded along. But after hours, I began building relationships with the people Thomas overlooked, the master mechanics who'd been with Dad for decades, the front desk staff who knew every customer by name, the parts suppliers who'd given Dad preferential pricing out of respect. How are you holding up, Mike? asked Ray, our head mechanic of 15 years, as we shared beers after a late shift. I'm managing, I said. He looked at me knowingly. Your brother's making a lot of changes. He is. Not all of them good ones. Ray hesitated. Look, your dad told me last year that you two would be taking over together. Equal partners. He was real clear about that. I took a long pull of my beer. Things change, I guess. Yeah. Things change. Ray's eyes narrowed. Or people change them. That conversation confirmed what I'd begun to suspect: people knew something was off. They just needed someone to voice it. 2 months after the will reading, Thomas made his first major misstep. He fired Carol, our office manager of 20 years, replacing her with a friend from his country club who had no experience in the auto industry. We need fresh perspectives, he explained when I confronted him. Carol was stuck in Dad's way of doing things. Dad's way, the way that had built a multi-million-dollar business from scratch. That night, I invited Carol to dinner. We reminisced about Dad, and eventually, the conversation turned to the will. It just doesn't add up, she said, shaking her head. Your dad would never have cut you out. He was so proud of you, Mike. Always talking about how you could fix anything on wheels. Thomas says Dad changed his mind near the end. Carol's expression hardened. That's not possible. I was the one who scheduled his appointments the last few months. The only major meeting he had about the business was with his old friend Barry Jenkins, you know, from Jenkins Financial. He was updating his life insurance, not his will. Are you sure? Positive. I handled the paperwork myself. There was no meeting with Richard Patel to change the will. Not on any calendar I managed. That was the first concrete evidence I had of Thomas's deception. If the will had been changed without a proper meeting, without Dad's true consent. But I still needed more. Proof that would stand up if I needed to fight back legally. Meanwhile, Thomas's changes accelerated. He laid off 3 senior mechanics to cut costs, then used the savings to lease a brand new Porsche as his company car. He shortened our warranty periods and raised our prices, alienating long-term customers. All while taking a salary nearly triple what Dad had paid himself. 6 months in, I made my first calculated move. I reached out to Jenkins Financial, claiming I needed help understanding some of Dad's old insurance paperwork. Barry Jenkins himself called me back. Michael. Good to hear from you. I've been meaning to check in. I was shocked to hear about the changes to your father's will. It contradicted everything he told me during our last meeting. My heart raced. What exactly did he tell you, Barry? That you and Thomas would share ownership equally. He was very specific: you'd manage operations, Thomas would handle the business side, equal control. He even joked that he'd set it up that way to ensure you two would have to work together and not kill each other. That sounded exactly like Dad. I asked Barry if he'd be willing to sign an affidavit about that conversation. In a heartbeat, he said without hesitation. James was my friend for 30 years. I won't stand by while his wishes are distorted. That was the beginning. With Barry's statement in hand, I quietly contacted Mr. Patel, intimating that I had evidence of will tampering. The attorney nervously admitted that he'd had concerns about the circumstances of the new will but had been assured by Thomas that everything was above board. Your brother provided witnesses, Patel explained anxiously. And the handwriting expert he brought in confirmed your father's signature. A handwriting expert chosen by Thomas, I noted. Patel's silence was answer enough. By this point, Thomas was fully embracing his new wealth. He'd bought a sprawling mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in town, started dating a local news anchor half his age, and joined 3 private clubs. He visited the shops less and less, trusting his new managers to handle day-to-day operations while he focused on strategic growth. What he didn't realize was that with every self-indulgent purchase, every betrayal of Dad's business philosophy, he was handing me more ammunition. I began documenting everything: the loan that had disappeared into Thomas's personal investments, the company funds used for his lifestyle, the declining quality of service, the customer complaints. I met secretly with the most loyal employees, sharing what I'd learned about the forged will. One by one, they came to my side. 9 months after Dad's death, I made a connection with Martin Sawyer, owner of Sawyer Automotive Group, our biggest competitor. Dad had always respected Martin, though they'd been fierce rivals. "Your father was a hell of a businessman," Martin told me over dinner at a restaurant far from any of our usual spots. "And one of the most honest men I knew." When I heard what happened with the will, well, let's just say a lot of people in the industry were surprised. "Thomas is running the business into the ground," I said bluntly. "Taking out loans, cutting corners on quality, alienating Dad's loyal customers." Martin nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed some of your best people leaving. Ray Rodriguez just applied to work for me. Said he couldn't stomach what was happening at Miller's anymore." That was news to me. I hadn't known Ray was planning to leave. But it made sense. And it gave me an idea. What if there was a way for you to acquire some of that talent, maybe even some of those Miller loyal customers, without seeming predatory? I asked carefully. Martin raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. I need a job. A visible one. Head mechanic at your flagship location." He laughed. "You want to work for your father's biggest competitor? That would be quite a statement." "Exactly," I said. "And when people ask why, and they will, I'll tell them the truth. That my brother changed the will, that he's destroying Dad's legacy, and that I'd rather work somewhere that values quality and integrity." Martin smiled slowly. "Like dominoes falling." "Precisely." The announcement of my new position hit the local business community like a bombshell. The story spread quickly: James Miller's son, the mechanical genius behind much of their success, leaving to work for the competition. Customers began asking questions. Employees began looking for other opportunities. Thomas called me, livid. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Working for Sawyer? Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" "There is no us, Thomas," I replied calmly. "You made sure of that when you stole my inheritance." "I did not," he caught himself. "The will reflects Dad's wishes, Mike. If you can't accept that, save it. I know what you did. So does Barry Jenkins. So does Richard Patel, deep down. And now, so will everyone else." Thomas's voice turned cold. "You're making a mistake. I was willing to keep you on, to be generous. But if you're going to be vindictive—" "I'm not being vindictive, Thomas. I'm just telling the truth. And building something new for myself, with my hands. Like Dad taught me." I hung up before he could respond. The exodus began the following week. 3 senior mechanics followed me to Sawyer's. Then Carol, the fired office manager, came on as our new service advisor. Long-term Miller customers started bringing their vehicles to us instead. With each defection, I made sure the story spread, not with malice, but with simple honesty. I couldn't stay after what Thomas did, I would tell anyone who asked. My father built that business for both of us, and Thomas found a way to take it all. Now he's running it into the ground with debt and corner cutting. The pressure on Thomas intensified when the bank that had provided his business loan got wind of the company's deteriorating position. They sent auditors, who uncovered the commingling of business and personal funds. Thomas had used the company as his personal ATM, and now they wanted immediate repayment. With revenue falling and expenses mounting, Thomas became desperate. He called me again, this time with a different tone. "Mike, we need to talk. Things are complicated right now. Maybe there's a way we can work together after all." I'm listening, I said, though I had no intention of rescuing him. I could make you a partner. 25% of the business. You come back, bring those mechanics with you, help rebuild customer trust. 25% of what's rightfully half mine. That's your generous offer. It's better than nothing, he snapped, his facade cracking. Which is what you'll get when I'm forced to sell to some corporate chain that will fire everyone anyway. I let the silence stretch between us. 40%, he finally said. Final offer. No, Thomas. The time for deals was before you decided to betray our father's wishes. Before you forged his will. Before you stole what should have been our shared legacy. His voice turned panicky. You can't prove anything. I don't have to. The business is crumbling on its own. And everyone knows why. 2 weeks later, I heard through industry channels that Thomas was in talks to sell Miller & Sons, at a fraction of its true value, to a national chain known for buying struggling shops, stripping their assets, and closing them within a year. That evening, Martin Sawyer called me into his office. Your brother reached out to AutoNation about selling, he said without preamble. They'll gut those shops and fire everyone who's still there. I nodded grimly. That sounds like Thomas. Save himself at everyone else's expense. Martin leaned back in his chair. I'm thinking of making an offer instead. I looked up, surprised. For Miller & Sons. For what's left of it. The name still has value in this region, despite your brother's mismanagement. And I'd rather see those shops continue than watch a national chain dismantle them. So you keep them running. Keep the remaining staff. Those who are worth keeping, Martin confirmed. And I'd need someone to oversee the integration and eventual operations. Someone who knows those shops inside and out. I felt a strange mixture of emotions, vindication, but also sadness. This wasn't how Dad's story was supposed to end. Would you keep the Miller name? I asked quietly. Martin studied me. Would you want me to? After everything? I thought about it. Dad built that name. It shouldn't die because of what Thomas did. Then yes, we'll keep it. Maybe, Miller division of Sawyer Automotive. And you'd run it. Full autonomy, profit sharing, the works. It wasn't ownership, but it was something, a chance to preserve at least part of Dad's legacy. Make the offer, I said. Thomas called me the day after he accepted Martin's proposal, which was far less than what the business had been worth but more than what AutoNation had offered. Are you happy now? He demanded, his voice slurring slightly. You've destroyed everything. No, Thomas. You did that. I'm just picking up the pieces. I know you've been behind this whole thing. Turning people against me. Spreading lies. I haven't told a single lie, I said evenly. That's the difference between us. There was a long pause. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You know what's funny? Dad always said you were the straightforward one. The honest one who couldn't play chess if his life depended on it. Turns out you're better at the long game than I ever was. I learned from watching you, I replied. All those years of your manipulations. I paid attention. Another pause. What happens now? Now you take your money and leave. Martin's keeping me on to run the Miller shops. We're going to rebuild what you nearly destroyed. And me? I'm just erased from the family business. For the first time, I heard genuine pain in his voice, and despite everything, I felt a twinge of the brotherly connection we'd once had. That was your choice, Thomas. You erased me first. I heard him take a ragged breath. I always thought Dad loved you more. The golden child who could do no wrong. I just wanted to prove I could run the business better. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about greed. Maybe, he admitted quietly. Maybe it started as one and became the other. The line went silent for so long I thought he'd hung up. "Goodbye, Mike," he finally said. "I doubt we'll speak again." "Probably not," I agreed. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by Dad's old repair manuals that I'd taken before Thomas could throw them away. I'd won, in a sense. Thomas had lost everything he'd stolen. Justice had been served. But as I flipped through the grease-stained pages of Dad's handwritten notes, I wondered what he would think of how it had all played out. Whether this Cold War between his sons would have broken his heart. The Miller shops would survive under Sawyer's umbrella. I'd make sure of that. I'd rebuild the quality, rehire the best mechanics, restore the reputation. And Thomas? He still had the money from the sale, less than he'd hoped for, but more than he deserved. He'd move on, probably to another city, another scheme. I closed the repair manual and put it back on the shelf. Tomorrow would be my first official day as director of the Miller division. A new beginning, built on the ashes of betrayal. As I turned off the lights, my phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number. "This isn't over, little brother. You took everything from me. My time will come." I stared at the message, a chill running through me. Then, methodically, I took a screenshot, saved it to my evidence file, and blocked the number. Thomas had never understood the difference between us. He played to win at any cost. I played for justice, for what was right. But perhaps we were more alike than I wanted to admit. Because in the dark of my apartment, looking at his desperate threat, I felt something unexpected. Not fear. Not anger. But anticipation. Let him try.